Now I have to hit the button that says got it. You know, I help formulate and invent a lot of these things a little bit anyway, and they're really not very good. It's a treat to be here and to see old friends and well, to celebrate what was a great project. And I hope those of you who don't have the books will order them forthwith. I'm going to read from a number of the pieces around the 10 volumes without indicating where I'm reading. And I also will tell you that I did some editing to make things go together into a single work of a kind. And that in certain moments I'm going to read I'm going to read one poem in a few sections, not all the sections, from the new book that came out earlier this year, Letter to Poetry. And so again, pleasure to be here. Oh, the grand piano, the 70s. You were at that time so extraordinarily, infuriatingly, new-mintedly brilliant. Driving down Cole Street together, heading to a reading at the Tasahara Bakery, I heard you say, "Get thee behind me," terminology, and I grinned. Yet on another occasion, as with utter incomprehension, you attempted to explain Saussure's distinction between speech and language, I moved behind a pillar in the loft and rolled my eyes. Both of those are Bob Perlman. Yet it was part of the disequilibrious relationship I had with you, my new friends, to disbelieve what you believed, an opportunity that made you all the more attractive to me. This is how I understand the phrase, the person who makes, who arises in the identification, as a source of attraction, an occasion for desire, both an indication of space and someone to love. You were reading Shklovsky. I was reading Georges Bataille. It seemed to me then, as it still does now, that the critique of authority, of the singular self and its authorship of the poem as a singular document, all that just seemed a form of ressentiment to me, and to leave aside the multiplicity that interested me, which is not of the self as an author, but elsewhere, a multiplicity thinking back to be sought, of what was sought. Walter, in the mid-60s, under the influence of my then teacher, Hannah Arendt, I'd been reading Walter Benjamin and had come to see the incredible effort it cost him to arrive at authorship, that the singularity of self was an achievement. In any case, having left the academy after teaching college through most of my 20s, largely to ditch my own schemata, I was made restless by new ones. I'd grown up early. I was married before I was 21, a father of 2 at 24, divorced at 27. I turned 34 in 1976, the year I met most of you. My father's age when he died. I'd lived in Chicago, New York, and Paris before San Francisco. I'd had several careers, college professor, editor, research writer for UNESCO. But by the time we met, I had decided to stay away from any path that might lead to another career, the last thing I wanted. And the truth is, in the now almost 50 years since then, I've never had another career. Although, of course, I did many things for many years to make the money I needed to live, but I never really had a career. Remember the tune. While I sketch out extra decades I'll never need, you read this page of missing words each time you drive the perfect circle of my cage. Rattle my chains, upend my tomb, components ablaze upon the curve of God's cryptography. I believe I'll dust my broom. In a notebook From the mid-70s, I wrote, he wants to sleep beneath a single light that breaks up meditation. The sentence recalls a sooty seventh floor walk-up in Paris, a chambre de bonne, maid's room, where I lived for a few months in early 1973. Nostalgie de la boue, the French call that. A bulb hung from a wire. The room held a cold water sink. A worn mattress lay on the floor. The small dormer window framed Paris rooftops and a cold blue sky. Everything is temporary, the room seemed to say. And at the end of a long evening, having climbed the dark and dirty stairs, I was a puzzled and once in a while a happy man. I wrote my mother with my new address and heard back from her that she and my father had lived in that building in 1939, and that to elude the sûreté, which he did but only for a while, my father had slept many nights in one of the maids' rooms, perhaps the one where I now found myself. At the time, I was studying with an extraordinary man, an elderly Chinese writer living out his late 70s in Paris after having lived his 20s there as well. A professor of French at Peking University at the time of the revolution, he'd been under house arrest for 2 decades and then had been released and managed to return to France. When I told him of my mother's letter, he responded immediately that I should leave Paris. This place is old. It's filled with death. The past makes me young, but it will make you old. A month or so later, I returned to the US. Sow ideas, reap ideas, ash covers embers. What we know dies, a fire in the mind. Every stroke he makes tunes the instruments. Every time I look backstage, history takes me back a page to where paralyzed constants await revisions that never arrive. Polynomials rise and fall so fast, you're afraid to teach one thing about a dozen of the other. On the day that you return, your last advanced decree, I believe I'll dust my broom. In early 1975, through the father of a friend, I was given the opportunity to meet the film director, Don Siegel. I flew to Southern California. As my plane landed in Burbank, a Navy pilot crashed his aircraft on another runway. The airport filled with smoke and an atmosphere of panic. There was no way to get a taxi. On my map, Universal Studios looked to be about a 10-mile walk. So I set out on foot, thinking to pick up a bus along the way. This was my first visit to Southern California. There were no buses. I was wearing brand new black cowboy boots with pointy toes, stirrup heels, and scroll work up and down their sides. I found the going tough and began to develop painful blisters after about 30 minutes. I didn't dare remove my boots. I was afraid I wouldn't get them back on. Another hour passed. Surely I had miscalculated my route. Eventually, I found myself on a small street of shops and hailed a taxi, limping toward it as the driver pulled to the side of the road. Siegel was at a desk in his trailer. I sat across from him as we chatted. My feet throbbed inside my boots. After a while, we walked over to the canteen and went through the lunch line. The place was full of actors. I recognized some of them, but didn't know their names. They seemed completely strange because they weren't acting. During lunch, we talked about Siegel's then most recent movie, The Black Windmill, which I had loved. A crucial scene takes place in a Belle Epoque restaurant in Paris, one I knew well. We discussed the scene. We talked about Delphine Seyrig, who was in the film. The conversation extended to some of her other films, Stolen Kisses, Last Year at Marienbad, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. I expected to leave after lunch, but Siegel invited me to accompany him onto the set of a TV cop drama. He had a bit part in the episode being filmed that day and asked me to rehearse him, handing me the script. I fumbled with it. Have you never seen a script before, he asked. Of course, I replied, muttering some excuse. When we were done on the set, I thought I should probably be on my way and began to say goodbye. Would you like to be my dialogue director? He suddenly asked. I was thunderstruck. I had wanted to meet him because I admired his work. I hadn't been looking for a job. Yet I did know somehow, or perhaps I learned later, that his previous dialogue directors included John Cassavetes and Sam Peckinpah. Unable to think clearly, I explained listen carefully. Unable to think clearly, I explained that this wasn't a good time for me to move to Los Angeles because I was trying to finish writing my first book of poetry. When I told this story to Harry Matthews a couple of months later, we'd become good friends in my years in Paris. He exploded. "You said what?" I came to my senses on the plane home and sketched out an idea for a movie thriller. Back at my place, I typed it up, sent it to him, mentioning in my cover letter that I changed my mind and wanted the job. I never heard back from him. Both the treatment and the letter were typed on the same huge gray proportional spacing IBM electric typewriter on which I'd started to translate Bataille's L'Annus Solaire. It is clear, this is Bataille, it is clear that the world is entirely parodic. That is, that each thing one looks upon is the parody of another. I play to win. I want to hear and instantly to care, unless postponing our collapse. We meet tomorrow on the corner where, folding your world inside my past, I believe I'll dust my broom. The best thing about being a writer is writing, doing it. That's Ray talking, though no doubt not her exact words. It's 1977, early summer, I believe, and we're strolling down Market Street towards the cafe floor. Behind us, a great prow of clouds extends from the hill that leads to the Haight, where my place is, and I think it's literature looming over us, listening in. Next best is to read what you've written to your friends, she goes on. Do I agree? It occurs to me that if Ray's words are correct, it must also be good to hear your friends read. And because this is true in my experience, I may be tempted by her expression. Do I say so? I don't remember. Sometimes a powerful impression exudes a fragment. Walking with Ray on Market Street under the protective cloud bank of literature, I like my somewhat overbearing, overbrainy self. I even like his restless, but doubtless well-meant desire to change, to be more modest, sincere, to shake off his ironies. Decades will pass and I will still like him, just as he does now in the summer of 1977. So in the summer of 2007, which must be when I wrote this, would he still want to change? Asking himself why he always wants the last word, the next word. Looking back, I will have no more grasp on his life in the 70s than he does now living it. I won't understand why he resigned his teaching job at the University of Illinois, stopped writing literary criticism, quit his fairly cushy position at the Macmillan Company, turned down the offer to become publications editor at UNESCO, an even more cushy job, and in Paris too, waved away Don Siegel's offer, all the rest. But looking back on him as he writes furiously and furiously pursues his interest in his new friendships with Ron, Ray, Lynn, all the pianists, I still kind of like him. Perhaps he left all those things, I will think. Perhaps he made all these friends in order to be a poet. An atmosphere is the habit of whatever perimeters occur within the first person. Let's take this matter up again when the ray of light bounces back from the mirror. I may seem to be passing off writing, doing it, to quote the line I gave Ray earlier, as somehow innocent, originary, when in fact it's an art of tradition. And strictly speaking, each work is a version of, a revision of another, just as its reader too has succeeded to another one, having been handed the book rather than having its aegis sent upon her. Sometimes the book is handed to one. On other occasions, one is forced to rip it out of someone's hands. And so the question remains, whose work is real? And therefore, who is real? Every page, this one included, is both palimpsest and battleground. Marble, unable, incised. Elsewhere in the GP, grand piano, Lynn reports Barry has asked to eliminate the word like from the poetic lexicon. Yet literature is like a great sailing ship. And though we writers may imagine ourselves manning her sails, or even think we are the wind that fills them, I fear we must be content instead with our role as the waves across which she cuts in her voyage, who knows where. Missing at a moment's notice, I'm ready to get startled on a scale of 1 to 10, from none to when the middleman has breached our walls and put the pressure on. I'll always remember the tune. The dish ran away with the spoon. I believe I'll dust my broom. Do not forget that a poem, although composed in the language of information, is not employed in the language game of giving information. That's from the Wittgenstein's Settle. On the train home, we sat across a table in the cafe car, and I said, I'm having trouble getting started on number 8. I said, what do you think I should write about? All there is to write about is sex and death, Ron replied, as his eyes moved through some pain to a moment of impassive humor. I've often thought that I would write an essay on my friend's eyes. Yet no matter the angle from which I view my own eyes in a mirror, they show me nothing. That is, I can see that they are looking at me, but no more. They are in the way of self-knowledge. Earlier that day, after the service had ended, the cars had all pulled away, and the young had smoked and departed. I stood outside for several minutes watching the snow fall. In a while, B came out of the building. You were having some trouble playing, I said. He looked at me uncomprehending. I was seated near you. I saw the way your fingers trembled. Yes, he said, understanding me now, seeing me for the first time, as it were. I was very nervous. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to play. I introduced myself and we shook hands. He seemed young. Earlier, I had noticed his fingers were delicate, though the tips were blunt. Now, with his oval face, almond eyes, and pale skin beginning to flush in the cold, he resembled a portrait of Spinoza I'd seen on a book jacket some days earlier. He was waiting for a cab, had arranged for a station wagon to pick him up. And when it arrived, I helped him load his keyboard into the back. If I'd felt helpless during the service, it was a relief now to have something to do. The cab drove away from the curb, headed uptown, and I turned the other way to walk down Amsterdam through the snowflakes, ready for solitude and to look at the living, for whatever thoughts and feelings might come. Cold, damp flakes fell, depositing a thin layer of slush beneath my feet. At 83rd Street, I turned left and walked down the block towards a building where I had lived long ago in 1970-71. The door was open in the vestibule. I found my name on the buzzer for apartment 32B, just as it had been the last time I checked a decade earlier. I'm sure it's still there. The presence of my name on any list marks a place where I am not and provides an occasion for surprise. I think of history, mine included, as a series of repetitions, each one of which we nonetheless greet as a surprise, convinced somehow in the face of the same thing over and over that something new has happened, worse than our worst fears. I didn't push the buzzer to see who was home, it might have been me, but walked back out the door to the present where the snow was still falling. The eyes of the mind are proofs, Spinoza wrote. Back on Amsterdam, I continued making my way downtown. I was on my way to the apartment where later Ron, I, and the others were to meet. Given the weather, the difficulties leaving and returning to Manhattan, and the hard task that was theirs, I knew it would be a long time before they returned, and I was in no hurry. I dialed Beth and recounted my long morning. I'd left the house before 5 a.m. to catch the 7:30 train in Wilmington and rendezvous with Ron, who boarded in Philadelphia 20 minutes later, and then briefly described the service we'd attended and what would happen the rest of the day. Just south of 72nd, Amsterdam ended in Broadway. In a couple of blocks, I turned left and continued toward the apartment that was my destination. I asked the doorman whether anybody had yet returned. I knew that P, N, and some other friends were upstairs making things ready. But when he said no, I continued walking. I stopped and leaned against the facade of the neoclassical Spanish-Portuguese synagogue a block away, the current home of the oldest synagogue in North America, founded in the mid-17th century by Portuguese Jews fleeing the Inquisition, which had made its way from Spain to Brazil. A few years later, its founding rabbi, by then back in Amsterdam, read Spinoza his cherem, his writ of excommunication. A remnant of one of the congregation's old cemeteries is tucked into a tiny triangle of land on 11th Street, a few steps east of 6th Avenue. As if I were an event that stood in readiness before the door of reality, then made my appearance, came into the room. It took some effort to push off from the concrete facade. My body had gotten stiff in the cold. I walked over to the building and rode the elevator up to the apartment. No one had returned. About a dozen people were milling around, waiting. I ran into Abigail Child, whom I hadn't seen in a few years, and we fell into conversation easily, talking about friends, love, and work. When I mentioned the grand piano, I saw her eyes cloud for a moment. Her chin lifted slightly, a tough guy gesture, totally characteristic of her. I'd seen it so many times. Words from an early poem came to mind. In the geometry of mind, each location marks a border. And I felt the long day, which until that moment had passed in a continuous and exhausting present, drop away, and heard myself say, "It's been a great project, and it's nearly over. I'll make a point of mentioning you in part 8, which I need to write when I get home." She laughed, and we embraced one another, and now I've fulfilled that promise. A moment later, the door to the apartment opened. A large group arrived, Ron among them. About a half hour later, he and I left. We had just enough time to make our train. Alles nachher werde fern. Everything close by becomes distant. On the train home, we sat across the table in the cafe car, and I said, "I'm having trouble getting started on number 8. What do you think I should write about?" "All there is to write about is sex and death," Ron replied unaccountably. My beloved friend, whose own writing acknowledges no border, meaning perhaps that writing itself, all writing, is both generation and closure at once. The train shifted noisily on its track. Outside the window, the landscape swept by in darkness. At Philadelphia, we hugged and Ron got off the train. In 20 minutes, I would be in Wilmington. I ate a Snickers bar for energy and thought about the drive ahead of me, 2 hours down the coast to the small town where I live. Once upon a time, an algorithm deep in the woods began to crawl the intellectual property that flourished unimplemented on the forest floor until at last it grew to be your signature. With much to tell before time fell, night passed quickly, then didn't pass at all. Your patents have been painted out. I'm done with you. I believe I'll dust my broom. Storm of the century. On an East Coast reading tour in 1990, I met Beth Joselo, a poet living in Washington, D.C. When I returned to San Francisco, I began to rearrange my life to be with her. And in March 92, I moved east. Beth and I visited the Bay Area later that spring, and I found my friend Ray Larson, somewhat hobbled, having, he said, injured his leg. By September, unaccountably, he was dead. The following month, I was in San Francisco again, this time to do a 4-night residency at Intersection. I stayed with the filmmaker Warren Sonbert, who had been Ray's partner, as we say these days. They'd been together almost 15 years. Separately and as a couple, Warren and Ray had been among my closest friends since the late 70s. Yet despite our friendship, age was not mentioned in connection with Ray's death. Not by Ray during his illness, and not by Warren a few weeks after his death. Warren must have AIDS too, I found myself thinking. Yet I could not imagine him dying. His personal glamour, his princely bearing, his brilliant way of offhandedly soaring past quotidian problems of any description, his uncanny ability to turn every experience to the benefit of art and life made it seem impossible. Now there'll be a cure, I thought, and bizarrely, I felt a moment of relief. The following March, Warren visited us in DC, and it was evident that something was wrong, very wrong. Beth had arranged for him to show films and lecture at the Corcoran College of Art where she taught. But when he set off on a walk around the block 15 minutes before he was to begin, it was more than an hour before he found his way back. Later that evening, Warren and I stood behind our house and watched snow fall into the alley, the first flakes of what was to turn into a blizzard. Since Ray's death, Warren divulged he had begun to experience periods of disorientation, as well as flashes of fury that arose for little reason, then vanished quickly. He was seeing a doctor who told him there might be something wrong with his brain. He expressed his frustration. This was difficult for him to manage. I was stunned. I'd never heard Warren acknowledge a weakness or personal limitation of any kind. Pleasure, amusement, desire, satisfaction, or occasionally ironic disdain, these were the feelings I was used to from Warren Sonbert. By the next morning, snow was thick on the ground and falling heavily. The three of us spent some of the day listening to chamber music by Janacek. Tickets for that evening's performance of his opera, The Cunning Little Vixen, awaited us at the Kennedy Center, Warren's comps. Having written reviews of opera performances for decades under the name Scotty Ferguson, which he borrowed from Hitchcock's Vertigo, Warren seemed to have tickets waiting for him at opera houses around the world. Driving slowly and with care, we made it downtown. There was a brief mix-up when we picked up the tickets, and I saw a moment of anger overtake Warren, then drain away. Soon we were seated, and the music began. And I meant actually to cue it right now, but I don't have the orchestra here. The Cunning Little Vixen is a work of Janacek's old age. He wrote both the score and the book. It presents the full cycle of life and death and new life, old age and youth, youth and old age, the passing of both, their return, their passing again, along with all things, in a simple story set among the animals of a barnyard and its neighboring woods. The production was immensely moving, and the three of us were in tears throughout. Warren's condition was never far from my mind, nor from Beth's, nor, I am sure, from his. Snow continued to fall. We made our way home in a silence compounded of the strange weather and our emotional states, overwhelmed by art and by life. The next morning, it was still snowing heavily. The streets were empty. Everything was shut down. Storm of the century, they were saying on the radio. Word reached us, I don't remember how, that the Sunday matinee performance of Janacek's opera would take place all the same, and that it was free. Anyone able to make it to the Kennedy Center was invited to attend. So Warren and I made our way downtown again, The audience was small, of course, 100 or so people in the big hall. Once again, both the work and the performance affected us deeply. I had come to understand over the last few days that my friend was dying. And somehow, if the expression of this feeling can avoid bathos, everything was. I was. We left the hall and drove slowly down Constitution Avenue. Warren had his Bolex with him. Though it was still snowing heavily, I opened the sunroof of the car, and Warren stood to film a group of hardy souls cross-country skiing around the Washington Monument in a blizzard. Like so many others lucky enough to know Warren and see his films, I had always wondered how he managed to capture the extraordinary shots that made their way into his films. Now I was participating. I had been in one of his films a few years earlier, arguing with a beautiful woman in a scene he staged. But this was different. Warren stopped filming and sat back down in the car. His face was bright red. His head was covered with snow. My head and face were snowy too from what had come through the sunroof, cold, wet. Melting snow slid down my glasses. I looked over at Warren. He was beaming. Both of us were. As if conversing with my thoughts, some feebler or more strenuous other, by magic, might arise. I, for whom to live is to think, don't furnish my soul, but shape it. It's one thing to be lost, they say, to vanish another. The rarities I longed for once are useless now. My banished vocation has been revived. I believe I'll dust my broom. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. That was so great.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Kit. I really appreciate it.
Now I want to suggest to everybody that you go to gallery mode for a Q&A. And to ask a question, just raise your hand, or you can type your question in the chat, and I will try to keep track of them.
Or send smoke signals if you prefer. Where is the chat? Oh, yeah, there it is.
I'm looking for a hand. Somebody give me a hand.
Margaret Rubino has a hand.
Margaret.
Hi, Tom. I have a question out of ignorance, but you keep repeating the same line. I believe I'll dust off my broom.
I believe I'll dust my broom, yeah.
Okay, so can you explain that one to me?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I should probably have offered to explain that.
No, I just don't know.
I believe I'll dust my broom is a line often heard in Southern blues songs, and it is Southern argot, and it means I'm leaving town. I'm out of here. And usually it's followed by, you can give my friend my room. My friend can have my room. I believe I'll dust my broom. My friend can have my room. And there's at least one blues tune with that name, but it occurs. Nobody knows why. Well, I mean, you can kind of get it, but all kinds of abstruse explanations, none of which have ever made sense to me, have been offered. It's just a beautiful phrase, but basically it means I'm out of here.
Mm-hmm.
No explanations of any of the other lines required.
No, and so why do you, why I mean, that's sort of.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, are you asking why when I wrote that poem, that line ends every section of it?
Yeah.
I just started that way and I liked it. And anyway, one thing I never do is try and explain anything. I don't have any more ability to explain anything I write
Mm.
than I have to explain anything Barry writes or Kit writes, or that you have the ability to explain anything I write. Just there it is.
Because it's kind of like the French saying, you know, je fous le camp. You know, it's like.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I would also say, if any of you, I mean, maybe many of you have not, if you don't know The Cunning Little Vixen, I can't recommend it highly enough. There's every possible internet medium will have a copy of it for you to listen to. It's one of the great works of art ever in any medium. It's beautiful beyond expression, really.
You know, that's funny because in the 70s, you know, many of us were listening to very out jazz. We were listening to Cage. You know, we're matching the musical, you know, we're matching music to the kind of writing we wanted to do. But at that time, I would listen intensely to Janacek.
Yeah, Janacek's great.
Well, yeah, yes, he's great. But there was something, I mean, I'm listening to Braxton, you know, and then Janacek. So what is it about, I mean, this complex harmonic stuff?
Yeah, also, yeah, I mean, Janacek broke very, you know, man, I'm not enough of, I don't know enough to talk too much about it, but Janacek broke from some ideas of the source of sound. There's a lot of nature imitation, you know, natural sounds that he heard in his garden or in his around his house that he tried to figure out how to notate, and he brought into his work. So if you listen to even just the opening of this opera, the opening overture, it sounds sort of like birds. I can't sing it, of course. I mean, I can't hum it even. I could only murder it. But I recommend it.
Definitely.
He's a fascinating guy, actually. There's a couple books by him, books that contain notebooks of his and so forth. They're worth getting into. And he, you know, I mean, this is a work of his old age. It's not his last work though, but it's one of the 2 or 3 last things he did. And he kind of had this in the last few years of his life, this enormous flowering of work. He fell in love with a young woman, a kind of a platonic love, I think of necessity, and had an intense letter, an intense correspondence with her. And I think she thought he was some nutty old guy, but she did humor him. And he had this incredible 5 years of the last years of his life when he wrote 4 or 5 all great operas. All of them are great. House of the Dead was the last one. Makarova Case. They're just great. Go listen. I mean, and if you don't, anybody, I mean, now that I'm on the subject, if you don't know the first string quartet, that one, when we're done here, you should get it by any, you know, just go listen to it on YouTube by any Czech string quartet, the Talik or any of them. They're all good, and the piece of music is extraordinary, really extraordinary.
Steve Emerson makes a comment in the chat. He says, Janacek, speech melody.
Yes. Right.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes.
Hi, Tom. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I'm going to take the liberty of not knowing any but 2 of you to ask an embarrassing question. This reminded me of chats in the past with you and listening to you speak, because you speak beautifully and tell marvelous stories. But for me, it verges almost on prose, almost like
It is prose.
Henry Miller's recitations of his life. So I shouldn't be looking for the poetry in the prose, except for
It's prose. This is what I said.
it's prose.
This series, Paul lived in my basement for in my garage for
Your garage.
several years. Mine and Ethan's when
Several months. Let's not make it too extreme.
anyway, this would be also 50 years ago. So he comes to this, not, and we haven't seen each other. Since I don't know when. It's just a delight to see you. So Google me on YouTube or find me on YouTube, and there's a poetry reading from a few months ago there. But this project, the grand piano, is a project that hold on, that
I'm not going anywhere.
no, I know that was to write. Well, that was expressed in the writing of these 10 books. 10 books, which are, as Barry calls it, a collective autobiography. I call it a collaborative autobiography, but it's the same books, whether you call it collective or collaborative. And they're on sale, Paul. You're perfect. We've got a mark here. Sell them to.
I'm retired, Tom. I have no money to buy books.
If you'll take them, you don't have to buy them. For you, Paul.
You give me a deal, will you?
You get free YouTube video recordings of all 10 authors. Just pay, just come back and there'll be 10 gorgeous recordings from the grand piano, and Tom just
they're all good, and everybody should come back. I mean, I have a lot of friends here, and it's a delight to see you. And if you haven't caught any of the others, I so far there have been 4 others by 4 of the other collaborators, and they just have all been really fantastic. Do I have that?
And listen, I just want to add that there was poetry tonight. You read poetry in between the prose, and
Bob,
it sounded like
on the ball.
It sounded like poetry too. I thought.
Yeah, it is
right away.
So
things started to rhyme and all that.
Yeah, I get a lot
Not that-
of grief for this, but I seem to be interested in using seeing I can use these traditional technical gizmos in new ways. I will say the last one I read, I should have said this and I wanted to. The last section I read starts with the following: as if conversing with my thoughts, some feebler or more strenuous other by magic might arise. I, for whom to live is to think, don't furnish my soul, but shape it. That's Montaigne. That's a direct quote from Montaigne.
Mm-hmm.
I can't give you the citation off the top of my head, but trust me.
Tom, you also reminded me that I went to see Janufa with Warren in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, that's a work of much younger Janacek, but a beautiful, beautiful opera. Yeah, we all miss Warren. Warren was a person the like of whom you meet once in life.
I did as well, Abby.
Were you with us when we
No, I
went?
went at another time, and
You
then
went, right?
then Barrett and I went and stood in the balcony.
Ah, great.
So yeah,
I also
So I-
saw the magic flute with Warren, which was wonderful because he elucidated.
It was hard to have a bad time with Warren,
That's true. I loved what you said, though, because it's absolutely true. You never heard anything down when you spoke with Warren. It was all upbeat. It was all, maybe disdain towards something. You were absolutely right. And I saw him at the New York Film Festival in those last years when he was ill with AIDS, and it was October, and he would show up in short shorts, like San Francisco short shorts. And you couldn't talk to him about. It's amazing he talked to you because he wouldn't talk about his illness, which made it hard to say goodbye.
Yeah. Well, he made, that visit that I recounted was not his last visit. He made a visit to us in a few months before he died. And I also went, when it was clear he was dying, Beth and I well, we had to go to San Francisco anyway, but we spent some days with him at his deathbed. I read Shelley's Adonis to him.
Hmm.
Go.
The
Well-
last time that I visited Warren, Ani and I visited Warren, we were out on his back deck, and I think the weather was warm, and he was wearing those short shorts. And I thought that it was because he was proud of his legs.
Definitely.
And
It's also like all the
they
gay.
were great. I mean, they were
Yeah,
great.
they were great. All the gay parades in San Francisco, the guys were always in short
Yeah.
shorts.
Well, in short shorts, if they're in anything.
Yes, or less.
And no, I mean, Warren had a high opinion of himself, but deservedly so, in the good sense of that. If that
Lynn, did you have something?
There's
Tim
a
Shaner
question in the
has a
chat.
comment.
Daner has an interesting question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tim Shaner. You want to say your question, Tim?
Yeah, sure. I'll just read it. How do you see the personal aspect of reunion and, in your words, the delight of seeing each other and, of course, writing together, and the institutional aspect of your collective place in history? And I was thinking of, I'm about to turn 65 myself, and so I really feel the joy in this gathering. But I'm also thinking of Alan Golding's book in terms of the canon. And so, that's my question.
Well, that's a great question. And Tim, I'm just starting to read your work and loving it. I just
Thank you.
ordered the Bar book.
Oh, great.
And so I couldn't be more delighted that you're here. It's wonderful. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I'm really flattered.
So the canon and all. Here's the thing. I'm so happy to have an excuse to say this because I've been mulling it, formulating it. Everybody who starts as a poet, not everybody, in a sense, naturally, one hopes one will become Wordsworth. Why not? The author of great works that are stand for his time, that are forever. But no one starts out wanting to be Tom Southey, who was one of Wordsworth's close friends, was the poet laureate of England for several years, was Coleridge's brother-in-law, and lucky for Coleridge, since when Coleridge would take off, I mean, he went to Malta on the drop of a hat and didn't send a nickel back to his to his wife and kids for 3 years. Southey took care of them. And Southey was once known for saying, it's just a shame that someone with as fine a mind as Coleridge will leave nothing for the benefit of humankind. And Wordsworth agreed with him. And so there is no canon. And so no one, people can try to be Wordsworth. I mean, they will, but they won't try to be Southey. And the thing is, no one can have in mind to become Coleridge, a man who couldn't keep his life together, a drug addict his whole life, who couldn't even manage to keep a place, had to live with other people, who was dominated by impulse, and who was a complete failure, except he was, as they say, the last man to know everything.
Yeah, but Coleridge wrote the Biographia, and the Biographia is, a totally coherent, great work that defines the relationship of poetry to philosophy. It's like you cannot take that away. So even though his lyric corpus was, or his poetic corpus is fragmented and incomplete, he didn't write the Prelude, right? He wrote the Biographia, and
No,
then you're getting into this whole business about the Romantics and the partial.
it doesn't matter. The Romantics don't matter in this. You're mistaking what I'm saying. What I'm saying is,
No, I'm riffing on what you're saying. I'm not mistaking it. Don't worry.
well, okay, fine. Then in that case, you are saying something different, which is certainly
Definitely.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not taking anything away from Coleridge. It's not just that. Coleridge wrote a book called Life that I recommend. I mean, an attempt to define what life was. I mean, as a
Good luck on that one. That's, you know,
I'm sorry.
good
All right, well,
luck,
here's
I
something,
say.
here's something for you, Tom. I mean, what about this poetics of the fragmented and the incomplete? You know, and the virtue of that, actually the affect, what's compelling about it, right? We just heard these wonderful moments where you'd sort of rip yourself out of one continuum and into another one, right? And dust your broom and then and do it again, you know? And it's, or you wouldn't keep a job or have a career, right? And, you know, so it adds up over the long term. You know, we get to, you know, it's, you know, we're crossing the Alps here or something like that. It turns out we didn't even know it. So you never know. This is the point is you kind of never know.
No, right. Of course you know. No, that's exactly.
So when I hear people talking, Pache, Alan, who's here, canon making, you know, it used to be Emerson talking about meter making argument. I thought some of us were back in the day were getting into canon making argument a little bit too quickly, I would say.
Well, you know, it's I've always loved the thing that wonderful. I wish I had it handy so I could quote it. Bakhtin saying that, you know, that what the meaning is of a work changes, never ends, and never stops changing, and it's true. It never stops changing, and no, there is no permanent canon. There is no canon. There's what's interesting is the enterprise as a whole. That's what's interesting. And the privilege is to be part of it. That's what you get. You get to have done what you did. And if you need a reward I mean, when is the canon formed anyway? You know, and how many have we seen vanish from the canon or be brought? I mean,
the canon is formed later.
Yeah, after you're dead.
You know,
Hey, Lynn,
listen,
did you want to say something?
No. I just wanted to call attention to Tim's question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
can I just throw in an anecdote, which some of you may well know, but I just stumbled across it yesterday on YouTube. I saw an interview with Robert Motherwell, and he recalls this evening where he was with 4 poets laureate, and they were all arguing noisily, and he tiptoed in there, and it turns out that they were all agreeing that Robert Lowell was #1 of the poets in America, but who was #2? And they couldn't agree. They're having a really violent argument about it. So that's another.
Has anybody read John Clare? Anybody of you read John Clare? If we had the
yes, yeah, no, Claire's fantastic. Fantastic.
I'm sorry?
Fantastic. He's great.
He sure as hell is. She shrunk like water from his grasp. No, he's incredible. And he was I don't know, you know, farm guy who was a poet and was briefly in the limelight in England in that, again, Romantic era. Highly recommended. John Clare, Clare.
Somebody's sound is on.
I'm wondering what Alan has to say about this.
Yeah.
Very little. I have to say. I do remember, Bob, the anecdote. There's a version of the anecdote that you just narrated involving John Berryman.
I'm sure it was fun.
There's somewhere where Berryman like takes a kind of perverse glee in something going wrong for Lowell. And he says, "Oh, does that mean that now I'm #1?" But I mean, that kind of like local jockeying for position is sort of uninteresting. I mean, Tim, you can correct me on this, but what I take your question to mean is something to do with the extent to which the grand piano is itself a canonizing gesture.
Not hearing him.
Is that what you're getting at? That is
Yes, but at the
that
same
is
time,
a way of placing a particular collective of friends and affiliates and shared poetics in literary history.
yes,
Is that-
and
that's
but at the same time, I don't mean to say this is disingenuous in that, I mean, for me, reading through these volumes, and I've read through all of them, thankfully, thanks to Kit, and I was very touched by this kind of return
it's a
to
very
the
intimate work.
collective, you know, and so
And this,
I
the
don't mean
sense of
to.
intimacy, I think, needs to be.
I agree. Yeah, that's
foregrounded.
really kind of what I'm thinking of, is the intimacy. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it was, and the other thing is, and I mean, in a way, to me at least, the greatest value of it, for me, and maybe perhaps for us, was it put us constantly in touch. And I mean, you know, we were on email back and forth the whole time, all the time, and talked a lot, and that was enormously valuable. Well, just fun and rewarding, delightful, you know, because it's not so easy. Well, certainly, I mean, maybe less so for people who are together, but there were not that many. There weren't any in the Bay Area anymore. Lynn and Bob and Alan, Barry was in Detroit. I was here in DC. I was in DC, not here. Well, I was here actually, come to think of it, for most of it, in Lewis, Delaware. And Ron was in Philly. I mean, you know, it was great. I felt that it was a shame. What would have made the work, would have made it all the more interesting if the cast of characters could have been more dynamic. That is to say, if the cast of characters could have swelled larger, and as it went along, or maybe been different. In other words, I think, for example, we would have all really liked Erica Hunt to write, Abigail to write.
Well, listen, I feel like we need to close pretty soon, but I do want to give Carla a chance to talk. I'm seeing some chatting going on, and I see Carla and I see Abby. You guys want to push that question to the group?
Carla, you start. You I like delightful and dissonant, but we can't hear you.
I was happy to be making noise in the background, like people might,
Okay.
might do in an audience where something that was going on was really great, but also made them feel agitated.
Yes.
And so, but I'll just say what I wrote, and then something about you know, some work that I've done that's tried to open up the question of the canonical to some kind of other emergent sense of possibility. And but that I can't really refer to very easily. So I just wrote, this conversation is delightful and dissonant with regard to, excuse me, the white male construction of the canon on which this is predicated. And then Abby says, yeah, well, you know, one could have started with or brought in Emily Dickinson, and Barrett said, yes, I just wrote on Lorene Nidecker, and there's no, you know, I feel no judgment about the names and the figures we are discussing, but I feel that there is a radical feminist poetics that postdates, I think, something on which this conversation relies. And I can't spontaneously disquisition on this, but I'm just going to say read what I wrote.
And just to clarify, Carla, when I said Emily Dickinson, I just meant in terms of Tom picking Wordsworth as what he wanted to be. And it's like that has not crossed, my mind actively.
Yeah. And so anyway, I don't want to object to
Let me have
I agree with Carla there.
yeah.
First of all, everything you're saying is correct, Carla, of course. And I certainly didn't want to be Wordsworth. I picked Wordsworth so I could get to Coleridge.
Okay.
I framed what I said in order to get to the fact that you cannot try to be Coleridge. And the point of you cannot try to be Coleridge is to undercut the notion of a canon. And I have no belief whatever in a canon.
And you know what, Tom? I totally got that in your work. So thank you. Yeah,
I would say what Carla's intervention there was an update and addition, not a corrective. I didn't take it when I saw it as a corrective.
Well, but it could even be a correct. I mean, I'm perfectly capable of being wrong. I do it all the time. I practice at it. I don't need that much, but I do.
Can I just say that I actually have experienced this as being much more about community, comradeship, friendship than any question of a canon. I think it was Tim who raised the question of the canon, and I wasn't hearing that in what you were doing at all, Tom. For example, the very long discussion about Ray Larson and Warren Sonbert, or the extremely close detail to the funeral of Susan B. Bernstein, which is in fact actually the structure of your work here.
That is correct. That's what it was about. That was what I want. I mean, the rest of it was there to make that happen, if you will.
Okay, listen, I'm going to wrap this up now, but you don't have to go. But we're going to end the recording, and I think that that was a wonderful conversation and a wonderful performance, Tom.